So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming on pleasant DC afternoon and during the holiday season. I know it's a busy time for us all. It's sort of become a tradition for the American Printing History Association to hold its annual lecture in the location that the next year's conference will be held. We hope to be able to make a formal announcement on that front soon, but for now, let us just say that we can expect that we'll be coming back to the Chesapeake Bay area for the conference in 2019. I'd like to take a moment to thank Mark Immunation and the Library of Congress staff for hosting this year's Lieberman Lecture. I'd especially like to extend my sincere appreciation to Dr. Stephanie Stilo for all the work she's done to help make this event possible. Additionally, I need to thank Presidents Haven Hawley and George Barnum of the American Printing History Association National Board, and also the Chesapeake Bay chapter for providing further support in putting this all together. The annual Lieberman Lecture commemorates J. Ben Lieberman, founder and first president of the American Printing History Association. And I'll just plug my own institution. His papers are actually held at the University of Delaware, which I just found out a couple days ago. So that's really exciting. I'm going to dig in to his history more. We are extremely fortunate to have Dr. Sarah Werner deliver this year's annual Lieberman Lecture. Dr. Werner is well known among members of the bibliophilic community. I first became aware of her work through her blog, Wink and a Word, which is really one of the finest blogs of its kind. And given that threads are currently in vogue now, I would have to say that her Twitter account, Lincoln himself, is a must follow. But no, her content, online content really speaks to her erudition and brilliance. Dr. Werner is a book historian and a digital scholar based here in Washington, D.C. area, who usually describes herself as an independent librarian. She taught early modern printing history at the Folger Shakespeare Library for nearly a decade, and is the author of Studying Early Printed Books, 1450 to 1800, a practical guide coming out from Wiley this winter. She's also the author of Shakespeare and Feminist Performance, Ideology on Stage, and numerous articles on theater practice, book history, and digital practices. Last year, she gave the Pforzheimer Lecture at the Harry Ransom Center on early digital facsimiles, and she's been a plenary speaker at RBMS and part of the Rare Book School lecture series. Her current project is a technological and cultural study of facsimiles. Her talk today, working towards a feminist history of printing, fits right in with the conference theme for next year, which is that of celebrating diversity in the history of American printing. So without further delay, please help me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Werner.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I want to say thank you to Jesse for the invitation and to the Chesapeake chapter and the Library of Congress for making all this possible. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I should warn you that kind of like what my scholarly career has been, this is less of a straightforward, here I am, here's my argument, we're just going to shoot down towards the end. It's a following of thoughts that we're going to sort of explore together. So I want to talk today about what a feminist history of printing could be and what we lose by thinking of it primarily in terms of the history of women printing. But first, I need to share some context for these questions. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. A few years ago, I began writing in earnest a guide to how books were made in the first centuries of the printing press, studying early printed books, the one that Jesse mentioned, and there are flyers on the back table. I had been teaching bibliography and early modern book culture to undergraduates for a decade by then. And the whole time I was teaching, I struggled to find a suitable text to help them understand the common press. Some guides were entirely too brief. They would touch on imposition and stop press changes, and then that was it. And then there was Philip Gaskell, who wrote a wonderful book full of details about printing, so many details that it is unfair to call it an introduction by today's standards. For true beginners, the book shares its knowledge so authoritatively and densely that it's hard to take hold of and find a purchase on it. You have to understand the full run of press work before you can really appreciate the significance of format, for instance. And yet, there is no helpful navigation system to let you move around the book as you might need. I do love it, but And so you follow Gaskell's lead, and if you read it enough times, or if you have a patient teacher to guide you through it, you might absorb enough of its subject to return to it on more equal footing. So I set out to write what I refer to as Baby Gaskell, a beginner's level exploration of how the hand press worked and why it might be good to know that. Another piece of context. My classes were overwhelmingly taken by women. They looked kind of like this room. I don't know about your classes if you teach, but I would wager that like classes in English or library science or history, indeed like many liberal arts courses, the student population is more female than male. Perhaps because of that, and perhaps because I am who I am, which is someone who is never not thinking about gender, our seminar discussions often turn to speculations about gendered reading habits or how print genders authorship. And so as I was writing my book, I started to worry about how it was unthinkingly replicating a gendered printing. My first book was on Shakespeare and Feminist Performance. Was I inadvertently writing a book that was printing in masculine press? But since I was writing about printing, not printers, where were my opportunities to intervene? Mine wasn't a work about books or about the book trade, so there wasn't a focus on authors or printers or booksellers per se, just a lot of information about machines and processes and discussions of why it matters. So how could I bring my investment in feminist theory and practice to the forefront of this work? 20 years ago, Leslie Howsam published a brief but pointed call to arms in Sharp News. In my view, Women and Book History is her advocacy for an explicitly feminist approach to studying book history. But Howsam isn't interested in excavating women's histories, and she deliberately sets that approach aside. Most of the women whose work in the book cycle has been so painstakingly discovered by researchers have been atypical individuals, outstanding anomalies in a cultural field dominated by men, she says. I think she might be overstating the assumption that such women were entirely atypical. There's evidence that in the first centuries of the printing press, women were an integral part of the daily work of bookmaking and book selling, if in small numbers, although there's also evidence that their numbers dropped off in later centuries. But her larger point, I think, is still germane. Adding to the scant list of women known to have been involved in the book trades only makes it slightly less scant. And such recovery work doesn't necessarily help us confront the social and political forces that shape women's lives. There is, I sometimes find it necessary to say, a difference between women and book history and feminist approaches to book history. A catalog of women is not the same thing as enabling a critical examination of the history of books or the methodologies we've used to study that history. Returning to Leslie Howsam, instead of fleshing out the list of women in the book trades, she writes, I want to suggest that book historians think about how the book has been implicated in those structures of masculine power and authority known to feminist scholarship as patriarchy. For her, in other words, the possibilities for feminist book history lie in working not with women necessarily, but with gender. The questions to ask are not who made these books, but how are books conceived of as gendered? As an illustration of this avenue of investigation, Howsam points to the language of conquest and courting used by collectors as one potential avenue, such as this, from Richard Curl in 1930. Books without points are like women without beauty. They pass unnoticed in the crowd. But books with points excite immediate interest, and everybody, so to speak, turns to gaze at them. As Howsam suggests in response, Perhaps we can also think about the gendered, possessive, not altogether unsexualized way that book collectors have fixed their gaze upon the object of desire. Some of you might want to pat yourselves on the back, thinking that 1930 was a long time ago. But his attitude still shows up in catalogs today. Rebecca Romney has been compiling examples like this one, a perfect companion to curls. Prettier copies are out there. And even though I live in LA, or maybe because I live in LA, I'll take the girl with depth of soul over the ubiquitous, superficially attractive ones. And that's from a catalog, yeah, exactly, just from a catalog just a couple of years ago. And this isn't the only one that shows how much the male gaze is still with us. Rebecca has a whole file of them. I'm really grateful to her for sharing some examples with me. And if you happen to come across examples of these things in your work, I'm sure Rebecca would really love to know about them. So, the tool Howsam uses to think outside this gaze is Jane Marcus's theorization of feminist aesthetics. As Marcus works through it, a feminist aesthetic is one that values process over product, one that avoids hierarchies and exclusions. For Howsam, this suggests a feminist praxis of book study that downplays possession in favor of utility. Instead of favoring first editions and famous authors, it might instead think in terms of less visible books that gain meaning through their social circulation. Perhaps, she suggests wryly, the way large numbers of readers, both men and women, make use of books may be just as interesting as the ways in which small numbers of authors, publishers, and collectors work together to create, fashion, and preserve books. Howsam's desire to focus on the utility and social circulation of books aligns closely with my own practice and preference of studying books, one that tends to focus on things like Berlamont's, the very popular multilingual phrase books and dictionaries published across Europe in editions too many to count. And many of you will already know this about me. To express frustration is what I do with things like the obsessive tracking of Shakespeare's first folio. And the Folger staff goes, oh my God, yes. It's not a novel approach to the study of books by any means, although it's still not something that is often put through an explicitly feminist lens. But I want to look a bit more closely at how Howsam incorporates Marcus's theory of feminist aesthetics into her own speculations. Much of the work Howsam does draws on this excerpt from Marcus's 1988 book, Art and Anger, Reading Like a Woman. This model of art, Howsam quotes, with repetition and dailiness at the heart of it, with the teaching of other women the patient craft of one's cultural heritage as the object of it, is a female poetic which women live and accept. Transformation rather than permanence is at the heart of this aesthetic, as it is at the heart of most women's lives. History is preserved not in the art object, but in the tradition of making the art object. It's this account of daily making that leads Howsam to the observation that feminist book history could attend to how books are used and attend to books that are part of the everyday and ordinary. What catches my attention, however, is how much this scenario reminds me of the act of printing. The repetition and dailiness and patience of working the printing press and setting the type, this is the unavoidable nature of the actions without which printing wouldn't happen. And Marcus's emphasis on making the art object resonates strongly for me with analytical bibliography, especially as I've spent the last years writing about how books are made and teaching students how to recover that process through the physical evidence left behind in material texts. So where does Marcus get this model of art from? Here's the full passage taken from Still Practice, a Rested Alphabet Toward a Feminist Aesthetic, the 1984 article that is one of the 3 pieces forming the basis of her book, And as an aside, I should note that throughout this talk, I tend to quote from articles that books were based on, largely because as an independent scholar, articles are a lot easier for me to access than books. And that, I think, is also something that's part of thinking about what a feminist history might be. Lipking, you should know, in this quote, refers to Lawrence Lipking's piece, Aristotle's Sister, in which he argues for a feminine poetics of abandonment, an important foil for Marcus in this, I know, lengthy passage. We could imagine another aesthetic, call it Penelopes, which grew out of a female culture. Lipking says that Amnesty, Aristotle's sister, cannot compete, of course, with her brother's tradition. Penelope's aesthetic does not wish to compete, is anti-hierarchical, anti-theoretical, not aggressively exclusionary. A real woman's poetics is a poetics of commitment, not a poetics of abandonment. Above all, it does not separate art from work and daily life. Penelope weaves her tapestry by day and takes it apart by night. Could Aristotle destroy his lectures and start over again each day? This model of art, with repetition and dailiness at the heart of it, with the teaching of other women, the patient craft of one's cultural heritage as the object of it, is a female poetic which women live and accept. Penelope's art is work, as women cook food that is eaten, weave cloth that is worn, clean houses that are dirtied. Transformation, rather than permanence, is at the heart of this aesthetic, as it is at the heart of most women's lives. The ellipses in Howsam, all the bits of the weaving that she has unpicked from this argument, are all the parts that are about Penelope. I can see why she would worry in her brief piece that it would be a distraction, that it would take too much explanation to give it proper context. But that this passage is about Penelope undoing her weaving every night makes it, for me, all the more about printing. As an aesthetic about printing, Marcus's account here works shockingly well, even better than with the omissions. If you've ever done even the smallest bit of work on common presses, you know that it is entirely a process not only of repetition, but of breaking down and starting over. Dab ink on the balls, work the ink, dab ink on the form, dab, work, dab, and at the end of the day, take the stuffing out of the balls, soak the leather, and next morning reassemble and start again. Pick the piece of type up, place it in the stick, place another, put the line on the stone, put another, tie up another page, tie up another, lock it up, print it off, distribute the type back into its boxes, start all over again. Place the paper on the tympan, fold the frisket down, fold the whole thing down, roll it under the platen, pull the bar, roll in once more, pull again, roll it out, open the frisket, take the paper off, put the paper on, fold it down, roll, pull, open, hang the paper, go home. Come back the next morning and do it all again. Penelope's weaving disappears each night, and a printer's work does not, since the printed paper remains in heaps and gatherings, but the unmaking of the press's parts are a key component to keeping the work going and the debtors at bay. And if you are, as I am, committed to the belief that every single copy of a text is unique, thanks to inevitable printing variants and to the vagaries of its individual life, then an awareness of repetition and variation makes an aesthetic based on Penelope's weaving all the more compelling. So let's talk about actual hand press printing for a moment. If I'm only interested in the mechanics of printing, that's the only thing really my book was about, need I think about gender at all? Well, yes, always yes, but especially yes in Renaissance England, where the word press was a term that could be used both to refer to printing, but also to a physical pressing of a man into a woman that is an act of sexual penetration and deflowering. The author might be a man in print, but he is not pressed as a lady is pressed. It is the book that is pressed, and the author who does the pressing, an ambiguity and anxiety that Wendy Wall works with in her 1993 book, The Imprint of Gender. But there need not be winks and nudges for sex to be brought into the topic. Lisa Maruca's 1993 Bodies of Type is the rare piece of scholarship that reads printers' manuals, not as transparent printing lessons, but for their rhetorical and ideological practices. In her hands, we are brought to see the gendered and sexualized language that is repeatedly drawn on in these manuals. Take, for instance, this passage from Joseph Moxon's 1683 Mechanic Exercises on the Whole Art of Printing, in which he describes the component parts of a letter mold. When his stick of letters is thus transferred to the mail block, he claps the middle of the mail block into his left hand, tilting the feet of the letter a little upwards so that the face may rest upon the tongue, and then takes about the middle of the female block in his right hand and lays it so upon the male block that the tongue of the male block may fall into the tongue of the female block, so that when the knot of the male block is lightly drawn towards the knot of the female block, or the knot of the female block lightly thrust toward the knot of the male block, both knots shall squeeze the letter close between them. We are so habituated to the description of plugs and other objects being described as female or male that it might not occur to you to note this passage when reading through Moxon. I don't think I did until I started reading Lisa's work. And of course, the language of the human body is used throughout. Pieces of type have feet, shoulders, heads, bodies. But Maruca points out that such language emerges in this period. The OED traces the use of male and female as adjectives for objects with projecting or hollow ends to the late 16th century. The first entry for male gauges is Moxon's passage earlier in this section about male gauges falling into female gauges. These are not just bodies, but bodies that are being sexed. In John Smith's 1755, The Printer's Grammar, the laboring bodies have disappeared, as Maruca points out, but a rigid gender hierarchy remains to govern appropriate typeface choices. The strong, upright Roman face should be used for the main text, with a delicate, flowing italic used only to decorate within the Roman context. Maruca's project in the work of print, the 2007 book into which her article is incorporated, is to consider the many ways in which the acts and agents of bookmaking create an ideology of authorship that is gendered and politicized. But what I want to call attention to is how effectively she puts down the wishful thinking that we can treat printers' manuals as transparent windows onto early modern acts of printing. So much of what we know about how books were made in the hand-pressed period are based on Moxon and Smith and the Encyclopédie. Bibliographers draw on their work to produce the works that become the basis of our study, works like those of McCarrow and Gaskell. How do we escape the masculinist underpinnings of our knowledge? Is it useful here to think about Diana Taylor's notions of archive and repertoire to deal with the tensions between reading ideological texts and a desire to recover acts of printing? Taylor's concepts, fleshed out in her 2003 book, are based in performance studies and geared toward recovering Latin American cultural histories. And while I sometimes get impatient with her dichotomy, I also find it generative. Here's a quick and superficial description of her concepts. Cultural memory is contained both in written archives and in bodily repertoire. When the dominant history of conquest has been preserved in archival documents, where can you find indigenous culture and history in its own voice? In the embodied history of experience passed down from one generation of survivors to the next, she says. Theater, dance, gesture, all can be valid forms of knowledge and history that capture what written documents cannot. So if printers' manuals are part of the written archive of printing history, and if they have an ideological slant, as Maruka's reading says they do, and as all things do, can we counter that bias in the physical repertoire of printing? Is a feminist praxis of printing history one that emphasizes doing over reading? Although printing practices have changed over the centuries, scholar printers have long been interested in early techniques of bookmaking, debating finer points, rebuilding presses, and relearning what was once known. There might not be an embodied repertoire that's been handed down to us in a direct line from London's printers in the 17th century, but there is an active repertoire living in bodies printing on wooden hand presses today. Bodies of people who are often eager to share what they know. It isn't only muscle memory involved in being able to pull the bar to lower the platen just smoothly and hard enough, but a physical knowledge that is expressed by doing rather than writing. And that repertoire of knowledge through doing is a central part of exploring how hand press printing worked. On the other hand, and this is no small point when we're thinking about equity and inclusion, books can be significantly more accessible than bodies and printing presses. There are only so many printers and so many presses. Printers deserve to be paid for their time. Replica presses are much too heavy to travel. How many educators work at a place where printing on a common press can easily be incorporated into your classroom practice? How many educators are active printers or have access to funds to pay printers a decent fee for working with their students? But books can be priced affordably. I know they are not always, but they can be. They can be resold for even less. They can often exist in digital form and be accessible to a wide range of abled and disabled users. You can take them home and revisit them on your own time if you didn't understand what happened in the classroom, and you can keep them until you've used them to pieces. Not that any of us would be so careless with our books. There are good reasons why we teach history from the archive and not through repertoire. And among them, that documents are more conducive to how universities are set up. And we should never forget the material conditions that inform what we do. If we're historians and bibliographers, in fact, our training should mean that we always keep those material conditions at the forefront of our thoughts. Let's go back to where this started. What is a feminist history of printing, and what do we lose by thinking of it primarily as the history of women printing? I've had to think about my own feminist praxis outside of recovering women's history because of my recent focus on explicating the workings of presses and libraries. But maybe that's only my problem. Why not look in the archives to recover who the early women printing in France were? Why not compile a catalog of books printed by women in early America? How is that not a feminist practice of book history? It can be. I can think of plenty of works of printing history that I would say are doing feminist work. And I can absolutely think of works about equivalent modern technologies, like Marie Hicks's recent Programmed Inequality, that are field-changing in profoundly feminist ways and that are consistent with the sort of work that we do in the history of printing. So I am not saying that such work isn't valuable, but it can't be the only feminist work that print historians are doing. Let's talk about recovery history for a moment, why we do it and what we're missing. Today's drive to recover the history of women's activities comes primarily out of the feminist movement of the early 1970s. We need to tell her story, not history, urged Robin Morgan. And it's no coincidence that the word her story first appears in print of part of the byline for Morgan's cri de coeur, Goodbye to All That, the editorial she published in the January 1970 issue of Rat Subterranean News, which was taken over by women in protest of the male editorial staff's misogyny. If Morgan was a woman inspired to commit herstory, as she signed herself, her readers were ready for it, ready to stop believing the stories they'd been told about what was good behavior and what was bad, what counted and what didn't. Let it all hang out. Let it seem bitchy, catty, dykey, Solanus-esque, frustrated, crazy, nutty, frigid, ridiculous, bitter, embarrassing, man-hating, libelous, pure, unfair, envious, intuitive, low-down, stupid, petty, liberating. We are the women that men have warned us about. That drive to look back at the stories we've been told and to see the gaps where we've been removed is powerful. Honest to God, every time I read through that, I get the shivers, right? We were all there all along. That witch in the corner of your eye is the widow who won't marry. That scandalous behavior is running a profitable business on her own. We are the women that men have warned us about. And we have always been part of history. It's powerful to feel that rush of connection to the past. Recovering the history of women, printing does that for us. And what about the history of enslaved women in the book trades? Or the history of indigenous peoples and the printing press? Where's the queer history of printing? The trans history? You tell me you've recovered the history of a previously hidden group in the book trades, and I will ask you about another group. Where are they, and what's the connection between them? If we are recovering history in order to make it all of our history, we are faced with the choice between either ignoring who is excluded from that all, or searching for more and more firsts and more histories to make the past more equitable. But you cannot simply keep adding recovered histories and think that it will take care of the problems of our overwhelmingly white male field faces today. It's an odd thing, isn't it, that I started off by talking about how largely female my classroom was, and yet here we are nearing the end, and I'm talking about how male the field is. But in this, book history follows the pyramid of academia and libraries and book dealing, in which there are large numbers of women studying and working at the lower levels of a field. But the higher the status of the job, the fewer women there are. How does recovering history level today's playing field? Here's another question to think about. What do you want the future of printing history to look like? Who do you want to be printing? Who do you want to be studying it? Who writing the stories? What sort of technology is part of this process? When I suggest that our field is facing problems today because it is white and male, what I want to focus on is how much knowledge and experience we are missing and how unsustainable this pattern is. Think about Dorothy Porter at Howard University and how she saw what the white librarians in her era did not, that the Dewey classification system collapses any possibility of blacks being seen through the lens, collapses the possibility of them being seen outside the frame of either slavery or colonization. Did you follow that? She saw that the Dewey classification system collapsed any possibility of blacks being seen outside of the frame of either slavery or colonization. What about Paula McDowell's revelations about women's participation in public print and debate in the 18th century? How could we even begin to think about book history as a discipline without Elizabeth Eisenstein? Our world would be immeasurably poorer without them. But when I look at my shelves of books about handpress printing, they are overwhelmingly authored by men. When I look at the companions and readers we use to teach book history, the sections that touch on technologies, those about printing and those about digital books, are overwhelmingly authored by men. When I look at my own citation practice in my own book, a book in which I was consciously trying not to repeat this bias, they're overwhelmingly male. This is the part where I shame myself thoroughly and profoundly. I was really horrified when I counted and I realized, look at those cards. The future of printing isn't going to be books on wooden presses written by and about white dudes. The future of printing and the future of printing history is going to be machines and computers and technologies that haven't been invented yet. And they'll be used to make texts and to circulate them and to circulate the texts that are about the making of the texts. And they're going to need to be written by a much broader range of people if our field is going to not only be relevant and exciting, but if it is going to exist. Bibliographers are a small group of scholars heavily indebted to the past, a past when women could barely squeeze through the entrance into Fredson Bauer's classes. And I really wish Barbara Mauer were here to tell us about that. And it's a past of male scholars and female typists that still determines how we understand and describe books. So why do we need a feminist praxis of printing history? We need it so we can thrive. We need it to expose why we do what we do and to invite more people in to help us understand the field. Let's turn back one more time to weaving. What does thinking about weaving get us in striving for a feminist praxis? The key part of the Penelope story is not simply that she weaves, but that she takes apart her weaving every night and then starts again the next morning. It's the willingness to dismantle, paradoxically, that makes her art an aesthetic of commitment and not abandonment. Abandonment would be walking away. Commitment is sticking it out. The problems, the errors, the suitors who try to control you. You fix the turned letters, the dropped lines, the last-minute insertions. Commitment is also dealing with the harassment of the suitors. And we call them suitors, but let's make no mistake, they aren't courting her. They're courting Odysseus's wealth. Penelope is using the strategy at her disposal to delay an impossible situation until she can assert her own will. Weaving is an art and an everyday activity, but it is also a protest. A scholarly practice based on weaving means not that we erase our writing, which we already do. It means that we keep our minds open to error and revision, that we lead with a willingness to relearn what we thought we knew, that we decenter ourselves as experts and situate ourselves in a community of questioners. And it means, too, that we make ourselves and our knowledge accessible. Are we publishing in locked away spaces, or are we participating in the open commons of conversation? Are we willing to learn and respond to changes in the world around us? If we insist that printing history is one thing only, that bibliography is one thing only, that a book is words on paper, we are locking ourselves out of the conversation. Remember, too, that weaving is grounded in the ordinary. We are all at this moment wearing something woven or knitted or produced through another textile form. I'm hoping that there are some people who might actually be knitting right now. There is nothing to be ashamed of in writing in straightforward language and on popular platforms that invite in people from outside our field. The everyday can be powerful and compelling. For all of my fears about whether, I'm not sure I have that slide yet. For all of my fears about whether my book was reproducing a masculine printing history, I think I was worried about the wrong thing. It's not the subject of my book that is the key, but its methodology. My feminist praxis lies in opening up the gates to a field of study, in making complicated, abstract ideas understandable and compelling, in inviting those who have been outside the field to move into its center, and unraveling and remaking the warp and weft of my own knowledge. I'm so grateful to you all for this opportunity to rethink my own scholarly practices. I hope this process of working through what a feminist praxis of writing print history might look like leads us all to think about how we share and open our field. Thank you. questions? Okay.
So we have some time for questions and answers. So I will open up the floor to questions.
I can't promise answers. I said I would take questions. I didn't promise. I'll try for answers, if anybody had any. Sheila.
Well, I have sort of a comment question, which is
Yeah.
very typical, right? But I just was thinking so much about all the threads that you're weaving for us today, and thinking about the book and the printed word and how those are reproduced, and how even today we are continue to reproduce even in new fields of research certain areas of digital humanities. So I wondered if you had a couple of thoughts on that, and sort of ways of pushing against some of that, the embodiment of book history as it's reproduced and reanalyzed sort of in new ways. So trying to bring that approach.
So, it's I'm never quite sure what to do with books and digital humanities, right? And the other handful of people I know who are in that sort of like interlocking space. Because on the one hand, there is a large and important body of work being done on texts in digital humanities, in which you OCR a text and you strip it out. And then you do all sorts of fun stuff with it, and it's important and not my thing, but there is lots of interesting work that can be done there. So on the one hand, the body of the book drops out altogether, right? And there's another group of people who are very book focused, who are interested in digital tools, but are very skeptical of digital tools being able to reproduce or make available the physical materiality of books. And I love digitization of books, right? Like this is my thing. I get lost in looking at them all the time. I think that we are so in the baby years of this sort of technology. And, honestly, what do most people do with books? They read them. I mean, I can't fault people who think that, books are words, right? Probably up until about a decade ago, I just thought of books as words. I wasn't thinking of all of the stuff that went into it. So I'm not super happy at the moment that there is this weird tension between, the body of the book is important and can't be digital, and text is always inherently digital. Obviously, if you're a bibliographer, no, you can't separate the text from the book. And we haven't yet, in digital humanities, I think, with the exception of a small group of people, really started to push at that and think about that. I hope that answers the... I don't know what to do with gendering about that. Although there is gendering to do with about that, in part because you guys know this, the text world is heavily dominated by men. I'm looking at Jen to be like, how should I phrase this? The text mining version of it is heavily male. And it's male in ways that often discourage women from participating in the field. So it's often exclusionarily male. I don't know if exclusionarily is a word, but so there's something going on in there too. Jen?
How does the book arts community sort of fit within that?
I don't know. And I was thinking about the book arts community when I was doing this because I wanted to find interesting examples, and then I just sort of said, you know what, I'm already mucking around in stuff that I don't know. I really don't know the book arts community, and it's so rich and it's so important, and there's so much happening there that I was like, I have to come back to that later. I have so many next books at this point. I have a slight suspicion that community might be more female than male. I think does that seem like an accurate? And there is again something about, I think, going back to the ways in which Leslie Housen was, think about how the book is gendered. I don't know, and stuff that Wendy Wall does. I keep coming back to this sense that the perception is that authorship is gendered male, but books are gendered female. It's a whole pressing thing, and I didn't talk about the emblems from RIPA that I dropped in here a couple of times. It's a book of emblems, so you get an emblem and you get a little thing about printing, and you get this woman who appears from the early, when printing first starts appears, there's that woodcut that was at the beginning of the talk of the woman, and then she keeps reappearing and she gets turned into, it's a horrible picture, isn't it? Like she looks like she's in pain. I don't know what her head's sort of falling off her head. Like it's just, but it makes so much sense to me that she's a woman because it's all about the press and it's all about the materiality. It's all about going back to that being pressed thing. So, Matt.
Thanks, Sarah. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Incredibly timely to at least for me. I was just before coming into the building, I was messaging with a friend, and I was using the copy and paste function on my phone to say over and over again, people can be famous for things besides being first. People can be famous for things besides being first, and that's occasioned by a recent death, the passing of a very remarkable woman named who has been widely and somewhat incorrectly reported as having invented the word processor.
Right.
And she had an amazing career. She did lots of things that are worthy of memory and note and celebration. Literally inventing the word processor was not quite one of them. And so
Right.
just this sort of conundrum of how do we frame histories, especially when they're sort of moved into the popular sphere when we're talking about New York Times headlines and that sort of thing, obituaries in the New York Times. How do we sort of find ways to frame histories that are not about primacy, about being first? And if, I mean, I think obviously that's sort of something that you're addressing, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts in particular on why we're so obsessed with firsts in various technological histories.
I don't know, but it's not only technological histories. I think about like what was the first sonnet sequence and who was the first women writer in print and who was, all of the, I don't know why, apparently we must be wired, like human brains in some sort of way to say like, it's a race, and first is the best, but first is so deeply problematic because, I don't know, second is just as interesting as first, and 500th is just as important as first. And then when you talk about printing back in, I almost called it my day, printing back in my day, as if I'm like 500 years old. We don't.
Good. You look good.
I try, there are so many lost records, and one of the big problems with recovering women's printing history in the Renaissance is that there's all these anonymous printers, like we don't know who they are. They have initials, or they continue publishing, widows, they continue publishing under their husband's name. Like, how do you actually find them? And then if you start getting into sort of other archival histories, Dispossessed Lives is written by, yes, Marissa Fuentes. So you get into other interesting questions about how do archival documents represent histories that aren't, it's like what I was saying about the indigenous stuff, histories that can't speak for themselves because they have been silenced by whoever's creating the document. All of those get in the way of firsts. I don't know, I'm not really interested in firsts. And one of the big problems is like the New York Times, a bit like you're saying, is like if you think ahead to like the next generation of scholars, if it wasn't for the work that like you've done and work that like Marie Hicks has been doing, we can see like somebody has taken the time at the moment to sort of excavate is the word that's coming to mind, to take apart the New York Times obit and say, here are the biases in there, the New York Times always talks about this. Those future historians would just, they would do what I do, which is you look up the wills, you look up the probate records. They do the equivalent of that. And they go like, oh, look, she invented that's not.
I love second. It's just as interesting as first.
I am actually the oldest child. I'm not sure I believe that, but my sister would be happy.
To me, you're kind of describing the moment in fall when you know the trees are prettiest. Not the first leaf that's beautiful, but there's a moment that you kind of look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, when people look back at our time, will they see a moment in printing? Or
That's
are we
such a
just
good
alive?
question.
Sorry, the sexist
No, you know, that's a super good question. I don't have an answer, and all I can say is I had a conversation with Fletcher Durant recently about binding in this, and he was on if you know Fletcher, if any of you know Fletcher, you can follow him on Twitter. He's actually also lovely on Twitter. He gets a bee in his bonnet, and then he just goes off on it. And he's a conservator, so like this is a world I don't really know, so I learn a lot from, I don't always agree with him, but like, and we were talking about the tendency for books today when they have to be rebound. If it's a book from, 1300, that oftentimes conservation will want to rebind it in a style that emulates the style that is appropriate to that period. And I was like, well, yeah, duh, what else would you do, right? Like we are so used to thinking about it. And he's like, well, think about where's the 21st century binding? Like where is our art? Where have we lost that? Because we are so interested in only recreating that. And I don't know, well, it's on 21st century books, but why can't it be like we value those 19th century bindings? Well, we're not stripping, value is not necessarily the right word because some of them are really hideous, and there's so many of those red and gold things. But we don't strip them off. I know, I want to sort of look around, like what do we got here? We've got a lot of the sort of the library bindings.
These are reference books. So
yeah. But there's just to sort of, I'm still like, well, I don't know what I would do with this in 21st centuries and 21st books, but to pause, what he did is he opened up this moment for me that I hadn't thought about. And I love it when people can do that for me, and that was one of the things I was struggling with in this paper is looking at something totally differently than how I would look at it and seeing what comes out of it. And sometimes what comes out of it is like, yep, I was right. And sometimes what comes out of it is like, oh, I need to go back and revisit everything I did because my index cards are embarrassing. Haven, that was not really an answer, but it's a really good question.
That's great. It's going forward, and I appreciate it.
Mark, and then I don't know your name. I'm sorry.
This was a great talk, and it's really
Thank you.
Thought-provoking, and I really appreciate your discussion of struggling when you're trying to teach to incorporate aspects of this beyond the object woman made and going on to something else, although it is very hard at times. But one of the things I find myself maybe sloppily dumping into is women as market, which seems to bring in more of a broader interpretation, and certainly in 19th century stuff we can talk only about women for quite a while in terms of what's made and what it appeals to.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts about that?
I think that thinking about women as users of books is very compelling and potentially really powerful. In part because it gets at questions of anonymity again, and it can sort of really turn upside down. People always want to believe that any mark in a book was written by a famous person. So I used to do this assignment with my students. There's like, you had to study the book's usage through history, as they would look at inscriptions, and and I would just sort of say, like, is it possible to figure out who, J. Doolittle is on it? I don't know. Is there like E. Dickinson? And they'll be like, well, obviously it's Emily Dickinson. I'd be like, no, weirdly, there are a lot of other E. Dickinsons in the world than that one. But the ways in which, so it's sort of, I do think that it can start to get at lives that we don't necessarily see when we're only looking at the firsts and the select fews. And it also opens up categories of books that we might not otherwise be focusing on, right? So like receipt books and recipe books, those are a huge focus right now. They're really interesting. And if we were still only focused on the high literary canon, we'd be missing that whole body of knowledge. And it's fun. And that's part of the direction that Hausum goes in her piece from 20 years ago, which I still find sort of shocking how relevant it is right now still. You had a...
So my question is kind of big, but I wanted to bring it back around to teaching and how we can inflect these kinds of feminist practices into the classroom, and how we introduce these ideas to a new generation of book scholars. And I was just curious about kind of your essential thoughts on implementing this kind of approach to book history with students.
So one of the things that happened to me as I started asking these questions, I was like, oh, I actually kind of have been teaching like this. So maybe it was sort of reassuring to me. Part of the context is that this course that I was teaching on book history drew students from different universities. It was based at the Folger, and there's no college associated locally with the Folger. So they'd come in from different places, and they came in from different fields. Like some of them would be like, I'm majoring in German, and they'd be like, I'm a biology major, and I'm a classics major. And then I would set them loose and have them choose books. And if you're 21 years old and you've never been in a rare books library, like, what's interesting to you? Weird, random stuff. Like, someone would be like, I've been reading The Fairy Queen, so now I'm going to work on this early edition of The Fairy Queen. And I'd go, oh, God, okay. It's a great poem, but the book's like, it's a lot of pages. And other ones would be like, here, I pulled up this weird treatise about math that's half in Latin and half in English. And I'd be like, I don't know what that is, and that's awesome. People pull up almanacs. And so my point is that for a lot of the books that they chose that they wanted to work on, I didn't know. I could not be the center of knowledge in that classroom. What I could be is the person who opens up the door and says, here's questions to ask. Here are places to go. Here are people who might have answers about this. Here's how you can find out what you're doing. What is important to know when you teach like that is it's terrifying. Right? Like if you've been trained to be the professor at the front of the classroom, you have been taught in graduate school that you are supposed to be the expert, right? You walk in, you're like, I know everything. You are just gonna sit there and you're gonna listen to me. And even if you've been taught to sort of like, I'm going to run a seminar, it's totally a fake seminar in which you are guiding the discussion to an answer that you already know that you want them to believe. And this is a situation where you can't do that. And they would ask me questions in class. I'd be like, I'm sorry, I don't know. We're gonna have to look at that and come back next week and talk about it again, because I love it, but it's hard to do. It's super rewarding. It's super rewarding. It's way more fun, because what's the fun in like getting people to get to the answer that you already know? It can, like after 10 years, it can be sort of boring. I mean, there's always moments where they come up with something unexpected, and you go, oh, I never thought of Tempest that way. But to let them grow as learners in front of you and to teach you new things, it's super cool. Yeah.
So I read somewhere that when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked what would be the optimum number of women on the Supreme Court, she said, of course, 9. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thing about the hierarchy and that mostly women are at the bottom, which I agree, the more women study, but fewer people are in positions of responsibility. But do you see any change in that in the last 25 years? Or?
I have not tracked it. It's funny, just on the metro ride coming in, Lady Science is the name of the, I know you guys know this, is the name of it's a blog, it's an online magazine, and they're really focused on sort of like questions about like science and gender, but they're having a series at the moment about libraries and gender. So they had just done a post today sort of about salary description in libraries, and they were saying it's not about that it's still there. It doesn't seem to have really gotten better in the last 20 years, and that it's not about tech. It's not just that the sort of like men do the tech and there are all these new tech jobs in the library, and that's why there's a discrepancy. The author's conclusion was it's baked into the hierarchy of libraries. I can't remember more. I don't know, Google Lady Science, maybe it'll come up. That was not a good reference librarian moment I just did right there. Jen just found it, yes. The Pink Collar Library, Technology and the Gender Wage Gap from, yes, December 13th, that's today. They just published it today. I did not hallucinate. Jen's also the master of finding links while you're talking.
I really just Googled Lady Science.
Oh, so it works! That was a good reference librarian moment. So Google it. But it was interesting to think about, especially in terms of sort of like how, that question of how many is enough. I just think to start with that question is always going to be limiting the number of whoever it is that we're talking about.
Right. I think Ruth Bader Ginsburg's point is that accepted that it would be 9 men for
Yeah.
200 years, why wouldn't
Right.
we accept that it could be that it could
Right.
be 9 women?
Right. And part of the, and then that has, right, like, that's another profession, which is there are way more women in law school than there are men. And that's been true for a while now. Like, it's really turning into, at least the student body, it's sort of like female. But look who are partners at law firms. Not that law firms are necessarily the be-all and end-all of life. It's a structural problem in lots of places. But that pink color, the Lady Science article, is interesting for libraries to think about. What is it that we are doing? And we're so well-intentioned, right? How is it that library conferences and book history conferences keep having conversations about diversity? How can we recognize that we are not a very diverse field? How can we get to be more diverse? We keep having the conversations over and over and over again, and yet look, the numbers are shifting. Last year at RBMS, this past year at RBMS, some lecturer gave that talk and she showed the numbers, and we were like, oh, well, that's great, because we've worked at it for like 20 years and it moved up 1%. I mean, she just showed it, the whole room gasped. There's something structural that we need to sort of revisit with what we are imagining libraries do, or history departments, or whatever field it is that we might be coming from to this. Yeah.
I'll ask the last question. We have time for one more. So, how have you encountered the ways in which the sort of patriarchal presence within printing history has suppressed our imagination around how we engage with books and text? And I'm thinking here of sort of an analogous relationship between medicine and midwifery, right? I'm thinking the ways in which sort of religious practice, as I found in my own research, has been very gendered. Right? You're always seeing the image of the fortune teller as a woman, right? Often a woman of color. So how do you think that sort of plays in, not just in the form of exclusion, but active suppression around what we conceptualize the book to be?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, where I see it, this in part goes back a little bit to Matt's question earlier, is the ways in which scholars describe and acknowledge the work of librarians and archivists around what they do. So it happened again recently. It happens, with pretty regularly. There's some article somewhere and it says, so-and-so discovered this new thing. And you look into it, you're like, well, yeah, you discovered it because the archivist produced a finding aid and then you looked it up. Like, that's not really discovery, that's following a path, and good for you that you know how to walk in a straight line. But I think that there is something gendered about that. The ways in which librarians and archivists don't get acknowledged. So it's the standard thing. If you like I got my PhD a long time ago. I trained to be a theater professor. Like I've spent a lot of time reading acknowledgments in books, right? Probably a lot of us have. And you do the sort of thank you to the Folger Shakespeare Library for funding me, and thank you to the Huntington, thank you to wherever. And you might name Richard Cookta. That was so long. You might name like the head librarian. You might name, for sort of like helping you, you might name the curator for helping you understand your things. But and then there might be a kind of sort of like, and the registrar was always so friendly to me, the person who welcomed me in every day.
Yeah, that you mentioned it.
But do people thank the
Catalogers.
Never. I thank you by name in my book. You and all the Central Library staff in the Folger. You can look it up. It says right there. Because it's a thing. We can't find those books if they haven't been bought by the folks in acquisitions, if they haven't been worked with by the curators, if they haven't been cataloged by the catalogers. We can't do that. And whether those people are male or female, the profession is gendered female. And so that's where I see the same thing happening with digitization. in which we think of that as being a male field, but nobody, you look to see digital images, digital facsimiles of books. So we're going to talk about this later this summer when Jesse and I do our panel together. Who took those pictures? Who the knows? If it was outsourced to Google's people, you might see some fingers, but you don't see names. Even if it's in-house, even if it's, I just talked about the Folger because I know it so well. Even if it's at the Folger, which has this very, for a long time, super careful photography and imaging lab. Very, like, super carefully, professionally, carefully, slowly done. You might know the name of the head of that lab, but you don't know, but she's rarely included in that, and definitely the people who are taking the pictures aren't included in that. So there's also a suppression there of that kind of labor.
Turn that around and explain why they should be.
Why they should be there?
Yeah.
Well, so do we know who printed the books in early modern France or early modern London?
We know the publisher or the print owner, but we don't know the names necessarily of the typesetters and the,
So in the stationer's company, if it's in London, you can go back, I mean, you can find who's been apprenticed to him. You can maybe have a hope of recreating. You're right that we don't always know the names underneath it, but there's a process sort of tracing that through. Just like those, so I've got two answers. Just like any compositor, you know, like infamous compositor E, who was always drunk and didn't know what he was doing, and he misspelled everything in the first folio because he was an idiot. What they do has an impact on what we read. And so maybe we want to have a part of that. But I would also say that libraries like to imagine that they are bastions of good ethical decisions. I can't think of what the word is that I'm looking for. Like libraries and librarians are magically good. This is the thing that drives me nuts. They're just inherently fabulous people who are always on the right side of history, which is, of course, idiotic because we're just people. But there is part of a way in which I think if we are tasking people to do that work, that their work should be acknowledged. And it can either be acknowledged through decent money, or you can get credit to your name. And we don't have the money. And I would also, what does it cost us to sort of like add that information? We're not talking like pages and pages of paper that we have to pay for. And the cost of paper today is going up, and it's a huge problem for people who are publishing today. It adds nothing to the file size of an image, I guess is what I'm going to go with. So why not?
Wow, you've done a wonderful job. Give me a hand.
Stop talking. Thank you all. This has been really helpful.